magazine. At noon, live coverage of a NASA news conference with NASA Administrator Daniel Golden. Then at 3:30 p.m., live coverage of remarks by House Speaker Newt Gingrich at the Republican National Committee's winter meeting. Now Ross Perot. Today he spoke at the National Press Club about the economy, campaign finance reform, and a lawsuit filed against the Republican and Democratic National Committees and others. He's introduced by Press Club President Richard Salmon. The program's 1 hour.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name's Richard Salmon. I'm the president of the National Press Club and a reporter for Congressional Quarterly. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching this program on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. Before introducing our head table, I'd like to remind members of upcoming speakers. In February, we'll hear retired Air Force General Lee Butler read a joint statement signed by approximately 100 former world leaders against nuclear weapons. He will speak on February 2nd. He's followed on the 10th by Pete Seeger, folk singer and American musical icon. Mr. Seeger promises to share his views and to sing a song or two. Following that will be Federico Pena, Secretary of Energy, on the 12th. He promises to share his views and not to sing a song or two. He'll be talking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And finally, on February 17, Alexis Herman, Secretary of Labor, will speak about the progress of the Welfare to Work program, and I'm sure that the Q&A will drift into different areas. Transcripts and audio files of National Press Club luncheons will be posted this afternoon at our website, and that is npc.press.org. To purchase audio and videotapes, call 1-888-343-1940. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I already have a lot, but if you have a pressing one, write it on the cards at your table and send it up to the head table. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please hold your applause until all the head table guests have been introduced. From your right, Chuck Hawkins, Bloomberg News, and a member of the 1998 Board of Governors at the National Press Club. Heather Ann Hope, House Action Reports of Congressional Quarterly, and Heather Ann Hope is also a member of the 1998 Board of Governors at the Press Club. Lisa Zagaroli of the Detroit News, Adrian Flynn of the Arizona Republic, Ron Hutchison of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Catalina Camilla of the Dallas Morning News, Pat Choate, 1996 Vice Presidential Candidate for the Reform Party, Willie Morgan, the publisher of the Journal of Commerce of the Economist Group, David K. Martin, Associate Editor of the Thomas Roll Call Report and Political Finance and Lobby Reporter, and Mr. Martin is Chairman of the Speakers Committee. I'd like to take one moment here to express my special thanks to Mr. Martin. You may know that this is the final program of my term, and we have had 71 amazing luncheons over the past term, and a lot of the reason is because of the hard work of Dave Martin. Thank you. Russell Verney, Chairman of the Reform Party. Mark Johnson of Media General News Service and a member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's lunch. Thank you, Mark. Bob Mary, President and Publisher of Congressional Quarterly. Angie Cannon of Knight Ridder Newspapers, and Joe Johns of NBC News. Who is he? Why is he here? Let me explain. In October, the Supreme Court of the United States heard oral arguments in an intriguing case about our campaign system. The question was whether organizers of a televised political debate could exclude an independent candidate because he was too far behind the Republican and the Democrat in the polls to have a chance of winning the race, essentially saying that you need to be popular to begin with before your ideas about this country can enter the mix of a televised debate where many voters make up their minds. As you may know, that independent candidate was Ralph Forbes, not to be confused with GOP presidential contender Steve Forbes. Mr. Forbes was a candidate for Congress in Arkansas who was shut out of the local debate and turned to the courts for relief. Our speaker today, also originally from Arkansas, shared a similar fate. Ross Perot sat out the 1996 presidential debates, and not by choice. The Presidential Debate Commission, after calling a number of thoughtful academicians and journalists, somehow skipping over me, said Mr. Perot was mired in the single digits in the polls and had no chance of winning. Well, like the car mechanic under the hood or the crazy aunt in the basement, he's back. And he's back for what may be an all-time record 9th appearance at the National Press Club, answering some of the same questions, seeing some of the same faces, and eating some of the same food. Would his political fate have been different had he never come to the National Press Club? We will never know. Mr. Perot, as you know, is a self-made billionaire, having created the computer giant EDS long before Bill Gates got his memory upgraded for the first time. He has bedeviled corporate officers at General Motors and campaign strategists in both parties. In 1992, he rallied millions of disenchanted voters who saw some hope for making government more accountable to its citizens. At the same time, Mr. Perot is a candidate who decries massive government spending but made his fortune off the explosive growth of Medicare. He chastises what he sees as a government run by lobbyists and special interests, yet he never hesitated to hire those same lobbyists in Austin or Washington, and through his wealth and corporate influence, sought ear of presidents from Nixon to Reagan. Perhaps most memorably, he abandoned his 1992 campaign only to jump back in weeks later, leaving many supporters confused, dispirited, or outraged. Today, Mr. Perot brings a message on an issue that has found only cool support among Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, but one that is central to American politics and governance: campaign finance reform. Perhaps no one in America is better qualified to talk about the two subjects of big money and changing politics than our speaker today. And if there is someone who is better qualified, they're certainly not as entertaining. For the 9th time, let's have a warm introduction and welcome for Ross Perot.
Nice to be with you. Privileged to be with you today. The theme of my speech today can be summed up with these words: when principle is involved, be deaf to expediency. In 1964, 76% of the American people said they trusted our government. 30 years later, in 1994, only 19% of the people trusted our government. 93% of the American people believe that our government wastes the taxpayers' money, and the most telling statistic of all is this one: 88% of the people believe that our political leaders will tell them whatever it takes to get elected, not what they honestly believe or intend to do. The next two statistics are the foundation for everything we'll talk about today. 73% of the people say that our elected officials work for themselves and their own gain and not the people they represent. 70% of the people say the government is run primarily for the benefit of the special interest and not the taxpayers who pay the bills. And finally, 2/3 of the American people believe that the United States government is on the wrong track. Our challenge is obvious: to put our government back on track. Restoring trust and confidence in our government, and that's why I gave you all those numbers. You couldn't run a business if that was the trust and confidence factor. You couldn't operate anything where you had to produce results. So we have got to restore trust and confidence in our government. I would like for all of you to assume that we have a central control room in Washington that has a complex instrument panel like the NASA Center down in Houston had, that will show us all of the vital information needed to evaluate our government, and that all of us are looking at this panel right now. We're just going to look at the facts. You say, wait a minute, this is Washington, Ross. We don't ever look at the facts. No, we're going into this room and look at the facts. The first panel is labeled Cost of Government. The display shows that we ran this great country for $100 billion a year in 1960. We pay more than twice that now just to pay interest on the debt. Today we spend $1.7 trillion a year, or 17 times as much. Now let's go to the second panel, debt. It shows that our country is $5.5 trillion in debt. And it has two messages below the panel to make the point. Our current debt exceeds the total amount of currency in print. So if we emptied everybody's pockets in the country and took all the money back, we wouldn't have enough to pay the debt. I think, and I'm from Texas, not Arkansas, down in Texas, Forrest Gump would understand that's too much debt. The second debt message is 70% of the $5.5 trillion debt is financed short term. No American finances your house payment short term because you can't pay it all back at once, right? Now, this is an even more interesting twist. Right now, long-term interest rates on federal treasuries are way down. It's the classic time to take this 70%, make it long-term, nail it at low rates, and eliminate any possibility of a real catastrophe later on if you get up to the 15-16% interest rates like we saw a few years ago. Don't hold your breath waiting for that to happen. Beneath this panel, Thomas Jefferson's words are inscribed. He said, if I could add one amendment to the Constitution, it would be to prohibit the federal government from borrowing money. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do it. Let's go on to the next panel, wages. You know, everything's fine. Everybody's got a job. You know, you hear this stuff coming out every day. It shows that real wages are down 20% since 1973, and that the standard of living is down for 4 out of 5 Americans. To say that you have a job is one thing, but then the question is, what kind of job and does it pay enough to support your family is the next question, which we never talk about. This panel has flashing red lights proclaiming that the earnings of a 2-paycheck family with the man and the wife both working are barely equivalent to a 1-paycheck family 25 years ago. Let's go on to the next panel. Let's look for something positive. Let's look for the #1 growth industry in the United States. That's our future, right? Guess what it is? There it is, lighted up on the panel. Government is the #1 growth industry. Not integrated circuits, not advanced technology, no, government. We'll say, does government make a profit? Nope, loses money. Does it make a product? Nope, sorry. Maybe we need another growth industry. Below this panel, though, we're saying, well, gee, what can you pay these people? They don't have a product, they don't make, well, they make 45% better than their counterparts in the private sector, and their benefits are 75% better. Where does all this money come from? Look in the mirror when you get home. The benefits, now, finally, in bold letters, and as we say in Texas, you ain't going to believe this one, the overhead for every single federal employee is $120,000 a year. No company could stay in business with that kind of overhead. Well, then how can the #1 growth industry in America stay in business? Because you and I write the checks. The next panel is labeled Manufacturing in the Good Old USA, and it tells us that in 1950, 90% of the goods made in this country, sold in this country, were made in the USA. In 1997, less than 50% of the goods purchased in the USA were made here. And under this panel, there's a sign reminding us that our great country cannot be a military superpower unless we are also a manufacturing superpower. And if anybody here disagrees with me, I hope you'll ask me some tough questions on that one. The next panel is merchandise trade deficit. Average citizen still doesn't know what it is. A surplus is good, a deficit is bad. In 1981, we had our last good trade surplus. 1996, the trade deficit had gone up to $187 billion. We anticipate a $200 billion trade deficit this year, but we are not yet to the problem that we are now facing. Already, 2 million manufacturing jobs have left this country, gone to Asia, where the workers make a fraction of what they make here. This occurred before the recent drop in Asian wages. Stand by for a major trade deficit in the year 1998. Next panel, let's go look some more good news. Income tax. It has a little historical section. It said in 1910, the average citizen paid $6.75 a year for taxes. Income tax law was passed in 1913, and by 1929, that had jumped to $29 a year. The trend had started. All you had to do was change the percent. Today, Strap on your seatbelts. The average citizen pays $5,700 a year in taxes. Federal, state, and local taxes now consume 40% of a worker's paycheck. All of the income taxes collected west of the Mississippi River, and there's a big map here in our control room that shows the Mississippi, and it's got red on to the west of it, green to the right. Everything collected west of the Mississippi River goes to just pay interest on the debt. Below this panel is the statement. Please review all of the other panels and decide, as a taxpayer, are you getting your money's worth? I'll leave that up to you. Now we go to the next panel. Every accountant in the room was brought up with this as a basic thumb rule. Assets minus liabilities equal net worth. Our great country's assets are $2.383 trillion. Our liabilities are $5.572 trillion. We have a negative net worth of $3.189 trillion. But there's a huge sign below this panel that says, don't forget, we have $17 trillion in federal guarantees that are unfunded and not included. Any government under the rules of the SEC would be required to list these unfunded guarantees as liabilities. Our government does not. So the real negative net worth is over $20 trillion. And buried in that, I think I need to bring up in Washington, you say, what about these very generous federal pension funds? We've got an $1.8 trillion unfunded federal liability. Now, in a company, you've got to keep your pension fund funded. But here in Washington, you don't, because they figure that as it comes along, they'll just dip in the taxpayer's pocket. Next panel is labeled, and this is my favorite panel, problems we are passing on to the next generation so that we can live the good life today. The growing deficit. You say, wait a minute, Ross, we're going to balance the budget. For 5 years, I showed the American people charts that showed that if you didn't do anything, it drifted down through the year 2002 and balanced itself. Articles have been written by the press that explain that what Congress did made that harder rather than easier, but a strong economy is letting it happen. But if we can ever bring ourselves to think more than 10 minutes ahead, think beyond 2002, and you will see that the debt takes off like a rocket. Have you heard anybody in Washington say that? I haven't. Have you seen anybody print or publish what I call the hockey stick chart? This come down to 2002 and off we go into the wild blue yonder. These are all government numbers. I want you to know I did not get them from some fortune teller. The forecasted budget deficit in the year 2020 is $1.4 trillion. We're going to be going in debt almost as much as we spend to run the country today each year. And by the year 2030, the debt will be, increasing the debt each year will be at the rate of $4.1 trillion. The annual cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid in the year 2030 will be $3.9 trillion. That's more than twice what we spend to run our country today. Now, if you knew you had a little cancer in your little finger, wouldn't you start treating it now rather than wait till 2030 when it's all through your body? That's all I'm trying to say. Now let's talk about the Social Security Trust Fund. God bless it. But there's not a Social Security Trust Fund. It's empty. If you go over there, there's nothing there except a piece of paper on the floor. It's an IOU. They don't even pay interest currently, so the interest on the interest is piling up. The Social Security deficit is forecasted by our government to be $5.5 trillion in the year 2050. They also forecast that 40% of a worker's paycheck will be required in the year 2050 just to pay for Social Security. We're talking about problems we're passing on to our children. They're going to have to pay for all that. That's wrong. Let's talk about public education, because if we have little children, they're getting that today. With all this money we're spending, surely we have great schools for our kids. In 1960, we had the finest public schools in the world. Today, our public schools rank near the bottom of the industrialized world in terms of academic achievement. Believe me, giving your child a fully developed intellect is far better than leaving your child money. And yet, we're not doing that. And finally, we say, well, what are our children going to have to pay in taxes? You'd say, well, nobody's smart enough to figure that out. Somebody must have been, because it was in the 1995 budget of President Clinton on page 25. Here it is, with huge flashing red numbers. The next generation to be born will pay an 82% tax rate. That is the end of the American dream. Now, let's go back for a minute. The people that came to this country made great sacrifices to be free and to practice religion of their choice. The people that fought the revolution and fought barefooted in the snow made tremendous sacrifices to give us a country. The pioneers, imagine going west in a covered wagon, not even knowing where you're headed. No roads, no Howard Johnsons, no Burger Kings. What kind of life is this? They did that. California didn't get populated by accident. With good news, you went in a covered wagon. With bad news, you went around the Cape, and you were lucky to get around the Cape, as you know. These were tough people who were dedicated to building this country, and they sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed to give us the country we have today. I'll bet 9 out of 10 of you would say that your parents sacrificed so that you would have opportunities they never had. Certainly my parents did. In contrast, we're spending our children's money, and we're putting their futures and the future of the greatest country in the history of man at risk. One of our biggest problems is that in our government, performance is not based on producing results. Now, in business, you produce results or you go broke. In your newspapers, your magazines, your TV stations and TV networks, you produce results or you go broke. But in Washington, you have a combination of theater, images, magic acts, and illusions. You have the soft, squishy photo of the day. Can you imagine a corporate chief executive officer saying, oh, I've got to go get my picture taken so that they'll love me at the end of the day? Maybe some do. I've never met one. Now, we tolerate all this acting and all of this non-performance and theater and sleight of hand routine, but we shouldn't. And you and I have to take full responsibility for what is happening. I think if P.T. Barnum were still alive, he would watch all this unfold and chuckle, yes, there's still a sucker born every minute, and we, the American people, are the suckers. I say we have to go back to a country where the leaders of the country and the people here in Washington follow the principles of scouting. They've got to be honest, trustworthy, and loyal. They've got to consistently do their duty to God and their country. They must keep themselves morally straight at all times. And finally, they must always be prepared. Now, that would be a nice step forward if we could just get that. Today, when serious allegations are made, the standard response is, I can't recall. Well, way down in Texas, I'm beginning to wonder if there's some kind of a memory loss virus here inside the Beltway. You know, I'm not sure that you can ask any direct question and get a straight answer here. And then you have very intelligent people with wonderful education said, well, I didn't do anything wrong, but I won't do it again. Think a bank robber could get out of jail with that one? I don't think so. Do you? Here's another one I love to say. After the Buddhist temple phenomenon, I thought it was community outreach. Well, let me defend that statement. They were in a community. That's true. There was outreach. That's true. They were reaching out for illegal money, and that's true. Okay. But now, if we let them get away with these carefully crafted little spin statements, we deserve what we get. Files disappear for a month. Witnesses flee to foreign countries. No action is taken on things that the American people want action taken on. Am I saying that these people stretch the truth? No. Am I saying they don't tell the truth? No. What am I saying? I'm saying they lie blatantly to the voters and get away with it. And I'm sure that all of you who live inside of it say, Ross, can't we call this spin control? I said, no, down in Texas we'd say, let's just call a dog a dog. You know, let's not fancy it up and call it a canine. Let's just call it what it is, and that's what it is. Now, again and again, as I wander around the country, people stop me in airports and whatever and say, Ross, do we have bad people in Washington? And I always say, no, we don't have bad people in Washington. We have good people trapped inside a bad system, and that bad system is principally flawed because it requires so much money for political campaigns, and that corrupts them. Now, let me give you an example. Let's assume that you and I were born on a farm somewhere where they grew marijuana and we're out in the middle of nowhere. We'd just think that's the way you make a living, right? See, if you stay inside this environment too long, things that are absolutely wrong seem normal. And you can understand why if you have an environment that gets you the money you want, that gets you the things you want, that gets you the elections you want, and so on and so forth, you don't want to tinker with it because it's human nature to resist change. Now, if we're going to cure this problem, we've got to have real campaign reform. And McCain-Feingold is not the answer. This is only a tiny, timid first step, and Washington has missed a great opportunity to play Washington. They should have passed this bill, had a big photo opportunity announcing that they've done campaign reform. 99% of us would say, hallelujah, amen, they've done it for us, and they hadn't done anything. Your biggest concern should be sham reform. We used to set higher standards here. Remember when Spiro Agnew got in trouble? He got punished. President Nixon got in trouble. He got punished. Speaker of House Jim Wright got in trouble. He got punished. Rostenkowski got in trouble. He got punished. Now, the American people cannot kind of understand that. But now let's look at today. Every case I have just given you is insignificant compared to the things that are in front of us today that nobody's doing anything about. Watergate, they broke into a place to try to steal some records. Now, that's wrong. But that's not as bad as taking tens of millions of dollars illegally and using it on a political campaign. But we don't take action anymore. This is being carefully swept under the rug by both political parties. Now, as we've already pointed out, the cost of congressional and presidential campaigns is out of control, and now we are renting the Lincoln bedroom for $100,000 a night. I think that's federal property. Check me. And they've had 938 visitors so far, and according to the news reports I've read, they contributed $16 million. I don't think the taxpayers who own the White House think that makes sense. Flights on Air Force One are being sold. Surely this, now then, you know, after everybody's saying they didn't do it, we now have videotapes of them talking about it. We've got printed memos of them talking about it. You've got enough evidence to take action, and nobody does a thing. We had in the presidential campaign, think of this one now, accepted funds from a convicted drug dealer, glad to take the money, but then when the press caught it, and the press did a really good job on all this. Now, you did a great job on Watergate, but the country followed through. You did a great job on all this campaign fund shenanigans, and nobody does anything. Fascinating, right? Different time. Now then, after the press pointed out they took a lot of money from a convicted drug dealer, they gave the money back. What if I robbed a bank and after you caught me, I gave the money back? Is that good enough? And then what if the chairman of the bank invited me to his next big event because this drug dealer was invited to the inauguration? Now, why will we put up with this? I don't know. I call this a new definition for the word chutzpah. You think to invite that guy to the organization, now that's chutzpah. I don't have a better example. Money raised for the Democratic and Republican parties was illegally spent by the presidential candidates of both parties. It's involved millions of dollars and major felonies. No action is taken. The Attorney General won't take action. The Senate Investigating Committee ran a little Mickey Mouse series of sessions, didn't get a thing done, finally folded up. Why aren't they doing it? Both parties who totally control this government, including the Federal Election Commission and the Federal Debate Commission, were caught red-handed, and they don't want to convict themselves. This technique was learned during the Keating 5 scandal. When both parties were found guilty, they pointed a gun at each other, and little or no action was taken. It was a formula that worked. It worked because we put up with it. We better quit putting up with it. Today, the system is totally controlled by the two parties. We waited since 1996 in order to give the system an opportunity to work. Justice wouldn't take action. Congress wouldn't take action. The President and the leaders of Congress promised us reform. Remember those big photo ops? Going to have summits, going to do this, that, and the other? And we said, hell, boy, God bless them, they're going to fix it. Didn't do a thing. Same time they were doing that, they were going out every night raising money the old-fashioned way. This would be like somebody that says, I want to get rid of drugs and going out and shooting up every night, right? Who puts up with it? We do. In plain talk, Washington today is bought and paid for by the special interests who fund the campaigns, and the American people are not benefiting. Let me give you just one example. We have one major contributor who gave $4 million over the last 15 years. He supplies airplanes to candidates. He sold a house at a discount to a senator in Florida. The house is in Florida. In return, his industry has received $3 billion in subsidies over the last 15 years. That's a 750 to 1 payoff, and not many of you have ever made an investment that good. But who provided the money for the payoff? Hard-working Americans did. The taxpayers did. As we speak today, Congress and the White House are busy trying to pay back the nations and international corporations who illegally funded their campaigns. by secretly destroying our patent system. This is the best kept secret in Washington, with no discussion and no debate. It's not the way we're supposed to operate here. Patents are a constitutional right, Article 1, Section 8. You cannot legally amend the Constitution by secretly passing laws. Believe it or not, inventors will only have one recourse if these laws pass, and that is to petition the World Trade Organization. How'd you like to be Thomas Edison, hot new idea for an electric light, and he's going to try to convince nations all over the world to give him a patent? Because when they don't, their people get to take that patent and produce it at a fraction of the cost that we could ever hope to do it here, and then he gets nothing for his idea. Why is this happening? Our large corporations, foreign governments, and foreign companies who contributed millions of dollars to the 1996 campaigns want to steal our inventors' new patents. It's immoral and inexcusable for these large organizations to band together and lobby for this secret bill so that the creative ideas of U.S. inventors can literally be stolen. If this is such a good idea, why is the whole process being carried out in secret without public debate? Now just draw the line in the sand right there. Let's open the windows and let's let the sun shine in and let's have a public debate on this. The answer is it cannot stand the harsh light of public debate. Why don't they just openly admit that what they're doing, again, is no better than stealing another person's money? As a matter of fact, stealing a person's ideas, I think, is worse than stealing money. I challenge the people who support this bill to come out of the closet. I will pay for the television time to permit a national debate, but don't hold your breath to watch this program. These guys are not going to show up to discuss this in public. If this bill passes, I will promise the American people one thing: there will be a constitutional lawsuit filed immediately, and it will be properly backed and properly funded, and we'll have the finest possible lawyers making sure this thing gets nailed as a constitutional issue. Finally, after waiting patiently since 1996 for somebody to take action on all of these criminal acts in the 96 campaign, and having seen no action, we have filed 2 constitutional cases that will allow the federal courts to deal with these campaign issues. The first lawsuit deals with the presidential debates and involves the Federal Election Commission and the Commission on Presidential Debates. We were excluded from the presidential debates, even though 76% of the voters wanted us, and our standing in the polls was exactly where it was in 1992. Now, let me tell you what really happened. After 1992, we found out that the only reason we got into the debates in 1992 is Bush didn't want to debate Clinton one-on-one, and that's how we fell into it. Wait a minute, these folks to have commissioners decide this, right? Now, 1996 is a rerun. Clinton and Dole get together. Dole really didn't want me in the debates. Clinton didn't want me in the debates, but he wanted to be able to say publicly that he did want me in the debates so that people would vote for him out of sympathy because he wanted me. All of this is on tape at the Kennedy School at Harvard. You know, after the election, they all go to Harvard and boast how they did it. High IQ, but low common sense. Okay. Now then, so in order for me not to be in the debate, Dole had to give Clinton the right to determine when the debates would be and what the formats would be. So they just cut a deal. In the meantime, Clinton was going to say, I really wish he was here. It has nothing to do with logic. The commissioners were not a factor. The 2 candidates did it. I think you would agree that this is clearly unconstitutional. Now, the debate commission is half Democrats, half Republicans, and it is a tough place for anybody that's not part of the establishment to have a voice. But they were not, they were just surrogates, as I've said. We immediately took this to the Federal Election Commission. Now, this is before the debates. The Federal Commission smiled politely and said, we can't give you an answer for 120 days. I said, well, that's not only after the debates, that's after the election. They smiled. And then we took it to the federal courts, and they said, we can't rule till the Federal Election Commission rules. And guess what? We've been pressing the Federal Election Commission to rule on this so we can take steps. They still haven't ruled, and that's why we're in court. Federal Election Commission just is a very slow operation. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the 2 existing political parties the right to control the political process, and every thinking American understands that. You can't be a serious presidential candidate unless you're in the debates, and if the 2 parties can freeze you out, that certainly makes the status quo permanent, but there's nothing in the Constitution that makes that possible. You say, well, why were these people so sensitive in 96? They remember that in 1992, according to the polls, we won 2 out of the 3 debates, and that's not a guy you want around again. Our second case is with the federal courts in San Francisco and concerns millions of dollars of illegal campaign funds that I talked about earlier. We couldn't begin to be competitive because we couldn't raise the money unless we did tricks like that, and we didn't do tricks like that. Our constitutional rights, and more importantly, the constitutional rights of the American voters, were violated. These 2 lawsuits are civil lawsuits. We can and we will depose all the people who committed these illegal acts. They cannot run and hide in civil court. Remember the second O.J. trial? We'll get these guys, we'll nail them, and the American people will know exactly what happened. The attorneys who will be handling these cases are with me today. As soon as my question and answer period is over, they will be available for a press conference to answer any questions the press may have, and all of you who are visiting are welcome to stay if you'd like to hear that session also. During the question and answer session, if you ask me any tedious questions about these lawsuits, I'll ask you to hold those until we go into the, and let the lawyers give you an exact and precise answer. I'm sure some of you are wondering why we do this. We're doing this because the people who should have done it, the White House, Congress, and the Justice Department, didn't do it, and because their political parties violated the law. We know that all the campaign fundraising and future paybacks are the root causes of this serious problem. Early in this speech, I detailed the problems our country must face and deal with, and if we fail to do this, our children and grandchildren will pay a terrible price. There's a song that was popular during World War II that included the phrase, "And I heard a voice within me whisper, this is worth fighting for." Surely we can all agree that these principles are worth fighting for, and we will fight for them. And through the fight, we will live the words, when principle is involved, be deaf to expediency. And finally, in closing, we will live the words of Isaac Hull. He was the captain of Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, who said, "If that fellow wants a fight, we will not disappoint him." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross Perot. The first question, you've often criticized those who would lobby for foreign businesses and foreign commerce, lobbying the United States Congress. That said, what are your thoughts on Bob Dole becoming a foreign agent?
My thoughts are down on writing in the Principles of the Reform Party. Part of the reforms that we feel are essential is that you come to serve and not cash in. And when you are a senator or a congressman or a president or a senior White House staff member and people of that category, you don't leave and then turn that service to your country into a multi-million-dollar estate. And the reason you don't do that is it sends a terrible message to current and future presidents. You don't have to be too smart if you're President of the United States to figure out how to get rich when you leave office. Just take care of those folks around the world, and then, as one president did, go to China and make 2 20-minute speeches for $2 million. Or go to Asia, not to China, I went to Asia. That's a pretty high price for a speech, I think. Must have had something profound to say. But, and it goes downhill from there. So I think we really need, this is back, you know, but they've lived in this environment so long, this seems normal. See? But it's wrong, and it doesn't serve our interest because it puts the interest of these people who give them huge amounts of money in #1 position, and you and I have to work night and day to produce the money that they're giving away for you.
You mentioned in your remarks that you thought the McCain-Feingold campaign finance bill was a sham. For the purposes of some of the listening audience, the McCain-Feingold bill is based on voluntary spending limits in exchange for free publicity in television radio time. Why do you believe that that bill is a sham? And also, you did not mention in your remarks what you would do to fix the campaign finance system.
Well, I've covered that so many times, and it takes a while to answer, but I'll be glad to cover it again. Step 1. I use it campaign reform, which is broader than just the money. Okay? Set the highest ethical standards for Congress and the White House. No more gifts, no more trips or junkets. No more free meals. Pass laws with significant penalties, not rules. Give Congress and the White House the same retirement plans and health care as the average American. Then they will feel your pain. Now, you tell me one reason why the people up here should have better health care than you do since you're paying for it. Now, I would come back and fuss at you the other way if you had better health care than they did. I think that they ought to have the same that you do, but I cannot understand all these special privileges. Campaign reform. Reduce the cost of campaign by shortening the election cycle to no more than 4 months. Vote on Saturdays and Sundays, not Tuesdays, so working people can get to the polls. Replace the Electoral College, which is it's as obsolete as a dinosaur, for electing the president with a direct vote so that every vote counts. Prohibit announcement of exit polls until the last polling booth is closed in Hawaii. Because if we know anything, the American people want to vote for a winner, right? Let's try to have them vote their consciences. Have you seen the exit polls from 1992 where they said, who would you have voted for if you'd voted your conscience? 41% of the people said they would have voted for me, 31% said they would have voted for Clinton, and 27% said they would have voted for Bush. Then they said, why didn't you vote your conscience? And they said, because we were told again and again and again and again, don't waste your vote on Perot. He can't win. Guess how they were told that? By spending millions and millions and millions of dollars of this money we've been talking about today. We didn't do that. Require the members of Congress to raise all money from voters in their district and members of the Senate to raise all money from voters within their state. And under no circumstances, if you are on a committee that has tremendous control over major corporations, could you ever take a penny from any of those corporations. And that is just a state-of-the-art trick. Now, get on one of those committees and you are set in terms of funding. Term limits, come to serve, not make a career here. 3 limits for the three terms for the House, 2 terms for the Senate. These are the fundamentals that we're talking about, and I can go on to restrictions on ever becoming a lobbyist, ever becoming a foreign lobbyist or a domestic lobbyist. And basically, let's get back to, I say, the principles of scouting here, and that will attract the people you want. We now have a gambling house mentality up here. You come up here, play the game, cash in big time when you leave, and do all kinds of things right down the edge of the field while you're here. You and I shouldn't tolerate that.
Mr. Perot, in 1992, a central part of your presidential campaign was the budget deficit. Now it appears as if the budget deficit will almost take care of itself through no other reason than a sweetened economy. I'd like to ask you if you feel that the credit for a balanced budget, if that indeed is what we will have in the space of about a year, is any of the credit due to the Clinton administration?
I'll say this again, I covered it in my main speech. I've been showing you this Congressional Budget Office graph that shows that the deficit would tend to go down to zero by the year 2002. Go back and listen to the White House and Congress. They kept talking about 2002, 2002, 2002. That's because it was going to happen anyhow. Now we have the economy is strong for the time being, but that's for the time being. And so we get there a little bit ahead of 2002. But these massive problems that I just defined in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, so on and so forth, that are out there in the future, keep in mind, when we created Social Security, we had back in 1945, I think we had 40 people, that's long after it was created, 45 people at work for every person retired. Then in the 50s, it got down to 16 people at work for every person retired. Today, it's only 3 people at work for every person retired, and you cannot have a pay-as-you-go plan. We've got to transition it, we've got to protect it, we don't want to take it away from anybody, but the sooner you start making the transition to a plan that will work with a huge retired population, the less stress you're going to place on your children and grandchildren who will be paying the taxes on what is now a pay-as-you-go system that cannot work. Medicare and Medicaid, as you know, are out of control. They've got to be brought back in to something that's properly run, properly managed, get the waste out of it, redesign the systems and streamline them, and make them work on a cost-effective way. So if you want to live in Never Never Land, just assume that these guys in Washington one more time, did a magic wand trick, and this was happening before they ever got here. Congressional Budget Office figures show it, and it goes off like a rocket. I'd be far more excited if they start talking about what they're going to do out here in 2010, 2030, because that's when the big cancer comes in.
One major issue facing the country and the world, and that touches on many of the themes that you mentioned in your speech, including foreign trade, including foreign diplomacy, and including financial management, is the Asian financial crisis. Should Congress approve the new U.S. contribution to the International Monetary Fund?
This is a very complicated problem. This is at least a 30-minute speech to explain, and I would really love to have the American people understand how complex it is. As you start pouring money, who is guaranteeing this money? See, a huge part of the guarantee comes from the U.S. taxpayers and the IMF and what have you. Money doesn't fall out of the sky. Now then, what is happening in these countries? Their currencies are going through the floor. You say, how could this happen? Because they had the world by the tail. Well, it was the way they ran the countries and the way they managed it. They blew it. They had the opportunity and they blew it. Now we're racing in to bail them out, and we've got to make sure that whatever bailout plan we have is one we can afford and one that will work, and one that they will learn not to repeat these bad habits, and they will have to pay the price for having done some of these things. We can't just bulletproof everything for everybody. In the meantime, now then, I'm one of these countries. My country is deeply in debt. I've got a giant labor force. They work for nothing. They're making tennis shoes for $3.50 that by the time we get them to the U.S. only cost $5, but by the time we do all the advertising promotion, you probably pay $150 for them. And if you can't afford them, you kill somebody on the street to get a pair. I can make those tennis shoes even cheaper, right? Because my currency's gone in the tank, my people are desperate, they're going to be working for less. Now then, if we make all the great things in the world, we've got to sell it to somebody to get my country back up on its feet, right? Guess who the biggest buyer in the world is? The good old USA. I think it's 5% of the world's population, roughly 25% of the world's buying power. Now then, as we buy these items at very, very low prices, more and more manufacturing is going to go over to these areas. We'll have less and less manufacturing here. We will take this phenomenon I described earlier where the father and mother have to work and barely make the paycheck that the father alone could make 25 years ago, and that the standard of living is down for 4 out of 5 working Americans. This is going to really create an interesting problem. There'll be a huge outflow of dollars back over to that part of the world paying for the goods. And that would give them the money to start to bail their countries out. And all we will be doing is getting the debt that we've guaranteed paid off if it works. And we've got to really, really learn from experience and be careful here and be sure-footed and not just arbitrarily lunge into these things without thinking it through, because this is a problem that is still unfolding. There have been some really interesting articles, see, because so far you haven't heard the word China mentioned in the press. But the economists and the serious thinkers whose work I've been reading in the past few days are saying this is going to impact China very, very soon. Now, China is a huge country with a huge percentage of the world's population. And as this problem grows, it can also impact us. So we've got to be careful and sure-footed, and it is extremely complex. But I want you to understand that basically all of these countries in trouble will be counting on selling their goods to us so that they will be able to get out of trouble, and that will cause more and more jobs to go to those countries and leave this country. They'll wind up with the jobs, we'll wind up with their goods, in plain Texas talk. So we put ourselves in a trap, and it's getting worse. Now, buried in all of this, these are the things that drive me crazy. You know what Mexico's #1 export is? Anybody raise their hand? Illegal drugs. Makes you proud, doesn't it? There is no way that you can stop all those trucks and inspect them. We've got this big company, Costco from China, that's got the big Navy base out there that brings in big containers. With luck, we inspect 1 out of 80. Now then, let's take that kind of percentage of inspection down to Mexico. I think if you and I wanted to, we could figure out a way to hide things that are small and get them through, don't you? Sure you can. I cannot. Now, keep in mind, you've heard the total. We're going to stamp out drugs inside the U.S. prison system. Well, I'm all for that, but I think if you can ever stamp them out anywhere, if you can't stamp them out inside something as tightly controlled as a prison system, we have got a problem. But if I can divert you to the prison system and away from the Mexican border and these other places, and there is no way I can overstate to all of you the damage that drugs are doing to this country and to our children and to the next generation genetically. And if you don't believe me, go to the charity hospitals and look at those crack babies. Typically, they're there 42 days, cost $125,000 to bring them into the world. Many of them are permanently genetically damaged, and the mother disappears in 3 days, and they become wards of the state. And down the East Coast a few years ago, these neonatal units were all at 125% or more capacity because of that drug problem.
The 10th grade history class of Mrs. Elmore at Catholic High School in Huntsville, Alabama, spent 1 hour developing 2 questions for Ross Perot that they wanted to ask, and they're both good questions. Mr. Perot, what is your position on the current crisis in the Persian Gulf? What suggestions do you have for the Clinton administration?
Follow Churchill's advice, never cozy up to tyrants. And if you don't want a Saddam Hussein, don't create him. Now, I beg all of you to remember, we created that guy. We gave him his nuclear, his chemical, and his biological capability. Then we went over to straighten it all out, and we got into the 100-hour war, and then we decided it would be great PR to stop before we accomplished our objective and took him out of Baghdad, got rid of him. I got a picture that an Air Force sergeant sent me. He's got Noriega sitting next to him, and it's the thumbs up, and basically saying, we got the sucker. That's what we should have done with Hussein. I wish I had a picture from an Air Force sergeant with his thumbs up with Hussein sitting next to him. But no, we didn't, because we had the perfect war, and we stopped before we take any more risks. War is ugly, war is dirty. There's nothing pretty about war, but the only thing worse than one perfect war would be to have to get into another one. And Saddam Hussein knows he can thumb his nose at us pretty well. And we've got to make it clear one way or another to him that we're not going to let him destabilize the Middle East. And in the meantime, we have allies selling him, people that we refer to as friends and allies are selling nuclear weapons. They'll sell you anything you can pay for. We are going to be in a very unstable world, no matter what we do, and the world of the suitcase nuclear weapon. Just imagine, think of all the stuff pouring into this country from all over the world. Don't you think you and I could get nuclear weapons into the country that can fit into a briefcase? Sure. Now, let's assume you had 50 of those and you had 50 martyrs who really wanted to die for a great cause. Can you imagine the chaos you could create in this country? This is the technology that we're facing as we go into the next century, and we have got to have a strong, well-prepared military force. We have got to be a military superpower, and we have got to be an economic superpower, because you can't be a military superpower unless you have the money to pay for all that. That's the way the walls came tumbling down in Russia. Ronald Reagan just spin them right through the floor. It was a high-risk deal, but he did it, and it worked, right? And in retrospect, we should all be very grateful but now we're into new phases. But we're going to have to be very hard-minded about keeping peace in the world and not get into a single conversation about it's good PR. Think how it would sound on television to talk about the 100-hour war. It would sound a lot better to have it over with, right? It would sound a whole lot better if we would have looked those men in the eye that were wounded in combat with chemical weapons and treated them when they came home instead of saying, oh, that's stress. I hope you followed that one. It's not stress. It's been proven medically that those men are ill. And God bless the Pentagon now. The Pentagon is working night and day to try to treat them, but they first had to have the hard evidence. That's been done. This is the unstable world we're in, and it's going to take a very strong, stable United States to keep the world a peaceful place in the 21st century.
Also, a lot of young college students and high school students thinking about their place in this American society have questions that raise different issues than may have been the case in 1992 and 1996, and that is the questions of affirmative action, both in in college entrances and also in the marketplace, in this new high-tech marketplace. What is your word to young people entering the society and about fair chances that they have with regard to affirmative action?
I'd like to talk to all of them, and I'd particularly like to talk to their parents, and I would especially like to talk to all of the people, let's say at the very, very bottom of the economic ladder, who are having babies. The greatest thing we can do is get it over to every mother and father in this country how a baby's brain gets connected. Trillions of neurons get connected. By the time you're 18 months, you have a positive or negative image of yourself. By the time you're 3 years old, you've learned how to learn or failed to learn how to learn, and by the time you're 6 years old, the ability of the neurons to connect has been starting to shut down. What chance does a disadvantaged child who's had no loving care from parents, none of the nurturing that you gave your children, have if the neurons are shut down? All the money in the world on education won't let that child tap the full potential. On the other hand, I can take you to a school that takes these little children when they're born, keeps them through the 3rd grade, and 80% of them are on the A honor roll when they go into the public schools. You want to change America in one generation? Cut out all these squishy little meetings here where you have somebody holding hands with 2 kids, and get out on the street and fix the problem, and we can do that. That's the greatest thing we can do. Now, to have this, let's assume it's a minority disadvantaged child, but to have that child's brain fully tapped, that's the key to that child's success. But if that child never got wired, in effect the neurons never got connected, all the remedial education in the world can't fix that. All the affirmative action in the world can't fix that. Now, we can do all those things, and I'm for doing all those things, but now that we know what the real problem is, this is kind of like putting your finger in the dike rather than trying to figure out why the dike is leaking. We can change America in one generation if we do those things. And I pray that at some point Washington will get energized and now, heaven help us if Washington tries to implement this program. Washington would have trouble getting 2 mules harnessed up and going down the road. The point is, the schools have got to be run at the local level. You've got to give the ownership back to the families and the community, and particularly in these very disadvantaged areas, you've got to have those schools for those little 1, 2, and 3-year-old children right in the neighborhood, and they need to be tiny because somebody's got to give them the love and the hugging and the attention and the reading too and the singing, and all the things you do is caring parents. That connects the neurons. And if you have not read this literature, please get it, because it's all available now, and it can change our country and change the world. Do you know the odds that a genius can be in the jungles of New Guinea is just as good as a genius can be in an upper middle class home when the child is born? Now, isn't it a tragedy that a potential Einstein out there will never have the opportunity because the neurons never get connected in those very early years? To show you how important it is, blindfold a baby at birth that's normal. Keep that baby blindfolded for 6 months, and the baby will be blind for life because the neurons that connect in and allow vision to go to the brain and see the pictures never get connected. To show you the impact, and this is a simple little thing, and I'll get off the subject. I hope everyone here that knows someone who's expecting a baby will say, sing a certain song to that again and again while you're pregnant. Then after your baby's born and while the baby's very small, sing some other song, the baby will ignore you. Sing that song and the baby will react. There's nothing that will ever replace love and attention. Now, when both parents have to work, we've had a big setback, right? And all of the fancy daycare in the world won't replace the mom and the attention that moms have traditionally given the little ones. But these special schools with people with special training and a deep love for these little children can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Perot. And before we close out, this is your 9th coffee mug. And also special gift that we're just starting to give out, sir. This is the brand new history book of the National Press Club. It's called Reliable Sources, available at the Press Club. There you go.
Thank you.
And also a certificate of appreciation if you lost the other 8. Here's one.
Okay, great.
Okay. Final question sent up. Do you have any money to lend to Newt Gingrich for his legal fees and ethics fines? While you're at it, any extra for President Clinton?
I give you a very short answer to that, no. Yeah, but you do understand that part of the deal was when Dole loaned Gingrich the money, It was with the understanding that Gingrich would have to pay Dole back if Dole ever became a lobbyist. Be interesting to watch that one, right? Let's go see what we have here. But let's put it in perspective now. These are not evil people. They're trapped in an evil system. And if we will ever have the stomach to straighten out the system, the same people that we're discussing here, under the new set of rules, can just be straight as an arrow. But we have gotten the cost of campaigns. See, the cost of campaigns has gone up by a factor of 9 and 10 in the last 15 or 20 years. It's just the price is obscene. And if we don't stop that, we'll have a continuation of this. And I'll leave you with this thought. When you think about all the things it took to create this country, and all the things we've talked about today that we should do, I would rather work on these things than on the really tough problems that people... I will take this any time over fighting the American Revolution. And anybody that understands war will too. That was a surefire loser. Now this shows, you say, is the impossible possible? We didn't have a chance against Great Britain. If anybody had understood the problem, they wouldn't have fought them, right? But deep down in here, they had something you and I don't have. They had the burning desire to be free, and they were willing to do it, and they did what it took, and they did it. John Paul Jones was sinking. Did you know that? Father of the American Navy, that great story they keep, but now, you know, the world of spin, you don't say, poor guy was sinking. The British, when they called out for his surrender, it was a non-issue. He was going down. As a matter of fact, he had lashed himself to the British ship to slow down the rate of sinking. And Jones called back, I have not yet begun to fight. But he had no idea how he was going to. But one enlisted man climbed the mast, went out the yard arm, and dropped a basket of hand grenades on the British ship. On his own initiative. You say, did John Paul Jones order him? No, John Paul Jones never thought of it. Nothing like creativity and initiative. There's a big explosion, and John Paul Jones at that moment knew what he was going to do. He boarded the British ship, he put the fire out, Jones' ship sank, and he sailed home to victory. All I'm saying is a lot of ways to win, right? And there's no excuse for losing, particularly when you look at what we have here. They didn't have anything, and they won the revolution. We have all 52 cards in the deck. Surely we can win this game, right? If we just have the will. Or we can sit back and listen to the Lawrence Welk music pouring out of Washington and think, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And there's no greater curse we could leave to our children or grandchildren. Yet if we just grab the bull by the horns now and go to work on these problems, every single one of them can be solved. And I hope we will. It's a privilege to be with you. And thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Kate Goggin, Joanne Booz, Pat Nelson, Melanie Abdow-Dermott, and Howard Rothman for helping organize today's lunch. Reporters who are here, we're going to take about a 10-minute break and end the luncheon part of this and go off the air as well. Mr. Perot will be around to answer some more questions as part of a Q&A. So if you're a reporter and would like to remain, please do, but we will take about a 10-minute break until we start that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Nice meeting you. Thanks for having me.
Good questions. They went well.
Is there anything they can do?
All of them.
John Todd.
You can tell me about this guy. We'd get time for that. That would be fun. Yeah.
Thank you, man. Give him my best. Thank you, Charlie.
Well,
Can I see?